Eleanor Vance had been born into a world of straight lines and hard surfaces. Her family's home, the largest in the burgeoning frontier town of Independence, was a testament to her father's unyielding will. Its clapboard siding was painted a stark, unforgiving white. Its picket fence stood sharp as a row of teeth, and its windows were always polished to a glare, reflecting the world but revealing little of what lay within. Josiah Vance was a man forged in the same manner as his house. He was a merchant, a man of considerable wealth and even greater standing in the community, and he measured the world in profit, loss, and reputation. Compassion was a currency he did not trade in. Her mother, a ghost in her own home since a fever took her 2 years prior, had been the only source of softness in Eleanor's life. It was her mother who had taught her that a person's worth was not tallied in a ledger, but in the quiet kindnesses they offered the world. It was her mother who had given her the small, silver cross that now hung from a worn leather cord around her neck, a cool, constant weight against her skin. It was the only piece of her mother she had left. The final, brittle thread of that old life snapped on a Tuesday. The air in her father's study was thick with the scent of old paper and new money. Outside, the autumn wind stripped the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods, but inside, the air was still and suffocating. "He is a man of immense standing." "Eleanor," Josiah said, his voice as dry as dust. He did not look at her, focusing instead on a column of figures in his account book. "Mr. Alistair Finch holds the note on half the businesses in this town. An alliance with him will secure the Vance name for generations." Eleanor stood ramrod straight, her hands clenched at her sides. She could picture Mr. Finch perfectly, a man twice her age, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his waistcoat and small, wet eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. Whispers followed him through town like stray dogs. Whispers of a first wife who had faded into a quiet, sad death, of a temper as cold and hard as the gold locked in his vault, of a cruelty that was masked by a thin veneer of civic generosity. "I will not marry him," Eleanor said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a thrown stone. For the first time, her father looked up. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were devoid of warmth. "You will do as you are told. This is not a request. The arrangements are made." "He is a cruel man, father." "He is a wealthy man," Josiah corrected, as if the two were interchangeable. "His character is of no consequence. Your duty is to your family, to our name." "And what of my happiness?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or sheer disbelief, crossed his face. "Happiness is a luxury for fools and children. You have a comfortable home, fine dresses, food on your plate. You will trade that for a more comfortable home, finer dresses, and richer food. That is more than most women in this world could ever dream of. Do not mistake your petulance for a virtue." Something inside Eleanor, a tiny, resilient seed of her mother's spirit, refused to be crushed. "I will not do it. I would rather scrub floors in a saloon. I would rather starve." Josiah Vance placed his pen down with deliberate, chilling slowness. He rose from his chair, his tall frame blocking the light from the window. "You speak of starvation as if it were a romantic notion. Girl, you have never known a day of true hunger. You have never known a moment of true want. You are a child playing with fire, and you fail to comprehend the cost of being burned." He walked to the door of the study and opened it. "If you will not accept the life I have provided for you, then you are free to find another, but you will not do so under my roof or with my name. Choose." The choice was no choice at all. It was an exile. To marry Mr. Finch would be a slow death, a withering of the soul until nothing was left but a well-dressed husk. The alternative was a terrifying, unknown abyss, but it was an abyss she could face as herself. "I have made my choice," she whispered, lifting her chin. Her father's face was a mask of stone. He did not rage or shout. His dismissal was far colder, far more complete. "Then you are no longer my daughter." He did not even watch her go. A house servant, eyes downcast and filled with pity, handed her a small canvas satchel containing a loaf of bread, a small canteen of water, and a single woolen blanket. Eleanor packed her mother's Bible and the few pieces of spare clothing she owned. As she walked out the front door, the solid, final click of the latch behind her was the sound of her world ending. She stood on the street, the wind whipping strands of her auburn hair across her face, and looked back at the house. The curtains did not stir. No face appeared in the window. She was alone, with nothing but a few dollars she had saved from her pin money. She bought a ticket for a westward passage on a wagon train, leaving the next morning, seeking a horizon far enough away that it might swallow the memory of her father's cold eyes. The journey west was a slow, grinding erosion of spirit. The vast, unending plains of Kansas and Nebraska were a canvas of brown and pale yellow, stretching into a hazy infinity that seemed to mock the very idea of a destination. The sun was a relentless hammer, the dust a constant, gritty presence in her mouth, her eyes, her very lungs. The other travelers were a mix of hopeful farmers, stern-faced families, and fortune-seekers with gold fever in their eyes. They were wary of a lone woman with no family to speak for her, and Eleanor, nursing the fresh wound of her banishment, kept to herself. She spoke little, ate less, and spent her nights wrapped in her thin blanket, staring up at a cold, glittering sea of stars, the silver cross clutched tight in her hand. They were deep in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains when the world came apart. Winter was breathing down from the high peaks, a chill in the air that promised the season's first snow. They had made camp in a narrow valley. The wagons circled like a makeshift fort. The attack came at dusk, with no warning. It was not a grand battle, but a swift, brutal raid. The sharp crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the terrified screams of women and the panicked whinnying of horses. Chaos erupted. Men grabbed for their weapons while others tried to calm the livestock. Eleanor was helping unhitch a team of oxen when the bandits, their face covered by dirty bandanas, rode into the camp, firing their pistols into the air. A bullet splintered the wagon wheel beside her head. Raw, animal terror seized her. She did not think. She simply ran. She scrambled away from the noise and the gunfire, into the growing darkness of the pine forest that lined the valley. Branches clawed at her dress, tearing the fabric. Her lungs burned. She could hear shouting behind her, but it grew fainter and fainter until the only sounds were her own ragged breaths and the pounding of her heart in her ears. She ran until she could run no more, collapsing at the base of a towering fir tree, her body shaking uncontrollably. She stayed there, curled into a tight ball, for what felt like hours, listening. The sounds of the raid eventually faded, replaced by the whispering of the wind through the pines. She had no idea how far she had run, or in what direction. When she finally found the courage to stand, the moon was high, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor. She tried to retrace her steps, but every direction looked the same. The camp was gone. The world was gone. There was only the forest, the mountains, and a silence so profound it felt like a living thing. For 3 days, she wandered. The loaf of bread was long gone. The water in her canteen ran out on the second day. She ate a handful of bitter berries that made her stomach cramp, and she drank from icy streams, the cold water a shock to her system. Her sensible leather shoes were torn, her feet bruised and blistered. The fine wool of her traveling dress was ripped and stained, offering little protection against the wind that grew colder with each passing hour. The landscape was brutally majestic. The mountains rose around her like jagged, granite teeth, their peaks already dusted with the first snow. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue during the day and a terrifying, star-filled black at night. The world was stripped of all color, save for the dark green of the pines, the gray of the rock, and the coming white of winter. It was a wilderness that did not care if she lived or died. It was more honest, in its way, than her father's house had ever been. On the fourth day, the sky turned the color of lead. A biting wind began to blow from the north, carrying with it the scent of snow and ice. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not survive a storm. Her strength was gone. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, and a dizzying weakness had taken hold of her limbs. Each step was an act of supreme effort. She stumbled through a thicket of aspen, their bare branches like white fingers reaching for her, and saw it. Through a curtain of falling snow, nestled in a small clearing near a frozen creek, was a cabin. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She pushed forward, her feet leaden. As she drew closer, the hope began to sour. This was no welcoming sanctuary. It was a husk, a skeleton. The log walls were dark with rot, moss growing in the spaces where the chinking had crumbled away. The roof, made of rough-hewn shakes, sagged dangerously in the middle, and a whole section had collapsed on one side, leaving a gaping hole to the sky. The single window was a dark, vacant eye, its glass long shattered. The door hung crookedly on one leather hinge. It was a place of profound and utter abandonment, but it was shelter. With the last of her strength, she pushed the groaning door open and stumbled inside. The air was frigid and smelled of damp earth, decay, and the ghosts of old fires. A stone hearth stood against one wall, its mouth black and gaping. The ashes within were ancient and cold. A rough table and a single three-legged stool were the only furniture, both covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. In the corner, a small wooden cradle lay on its side, as if it had been kicked over in a hurried departure. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose timbers of the cabin. Snow began to fall in earnest, thick wet flakes that swirled in through the broken roof and the empty window frame. Eleanor dragged herself to the hearth, curling up on the dirt floor, pulling her tattered blanket around her shoulders. It offered no warmth. The cold was inside her now, a deep, creeping numbness that started in her fingers and toes and was slowly making its way to her heart. Her mind began to drift. She saw her father's face, not as he was when he cast her out, but as he had been years ago, when he would lift her onto his shoulders so she could see the parade. She saw her mother's gentle smile. She whispered their names into the cold, dead air of the cabin. Josiah, Mama. The names were meaningless now, prayers sent to a heaven that had long since stopped listening. The world narrowed to the sound of the rising storm and the deepening cold. Her eyelids grew heavy. The darkness that swarmed at the edge of her vision felt like a final, welcome relief. She let it take her. Silas Boone moved through the forest like a shadow. Years of living in the mountains had stripped him of all unnecessary movement, all wasted sound. His buckskin clothing blended with the muted colors of the winter landscape, and his soft-soled moccasins made no noise on the pine needle floor. A thick, untrimmed beard, dusted with gray and frosted with ice, covered the lower half of his face, and a heavy buffalo hide coat protected him from the biting wind. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, missed nothing. The flick of a squirrel's tail, the scrape of a buck's antler against a tree, the faintest depression in the earth. He was tracking a white-tailed deer, a fine buck that would see him through the next few weeks of the coming winter. The snow was a blessing, making the tracks clear. But then he saw another set of tracks, strange and out of place. They were small, clumsy, made by someone with thin-soled shoes, not boots. The gait was stumbling, erratic, a fool from the lowlands, lost and walking in circles. He had seen it before. The mountains did not suffer fools gladly. His first instinct was to ignore them, to continue on his hunt. The world of men was a world he had left behind years ago, after the fever had come and stolen everything from him. He had no business with it. But the storm was closing in fast, a real blizzard by the look of the sky. No one, not even the biggest fool, deserved to die frozen in the snow. With a low grunt of annoyance, he turned from the deer's tracks and followed the strangers. The tracks led him to the old cabin, his cabin, the place he had built with his own 2 hands for his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Lily. The place he had not set foot in for 5 years, not since the day he had buried them on the small hill overlooking the creek. He kept a small, newer shelter for himself a mile up the ridge, a place with no memories. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his hand resting on the stock of his Hawken rifle. A knot of ice formed in his gut. The memories were always there, lying just beneath the surface. But this place gave them teeth. He could almost hear Lily's laughter, almost smell the scent of Sarah baking bread. It was a pain so sharp, so familiar. It was like an old friend. He saw that the door was ajar. Cursing under his breath, he moved forward, his steps silent. He pushed the door open and looked inside. He saw a heap of rags and dirty calico huddled by the cold hearth. For a moment, he thought it was just a pile of discarded belongings. Then he saw the pale, delicate hand, the slender wrist. He saw the cascade of auburn hair, now matted with dirt and melted snow. It was a woman, a girl. Really, she was not moving. He stepped inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards a protest in the silence. He knelt beside her, his movements stiff. He pushed the damp hair back from her face. She was young, her features fine and drawn with starvation. Her skin was a frightening, waxy white, her lips tinged with blue. He pressed 2 rough fingers against her neck. For a long moment, he felt nothing. Then, a pulse, faint and thready, as fragile as a bird's heartbeat. She was alive, barely. And Silas Boone hesitated. A war raged within him. His mind screamed at him to leave her, to walk out the door, go back to his new cabin, and let the storm and the mountains claim her. She was from that other world, the world that brought plagues and heartbreak. Bringing her back to life would mean bringing a piece of that world into his solitude. It would mean waking the ghosts he had fought so hard to put to rest. Sarah had died in this very spot, her body racked with fever, and his presence had not been enough to save her. What could he do for this stranger? He looked at her face, so still and peaceful in its near-death state, and the ice in his gut twisted. She was just a child. He saw the faint outline of a small silver cross beneath the collar of her ruined dress. He remembered the cross Sarah had worn, the one he had buried with her. The wind shrieked outside, a promise of the blizzard's full fury. To leave her here was to kill her, as surely as if he had put a knife to her throat. He had become many things in his years of isolation, a hunter, a trapper, a half-wild thing of the mountains, but he was not yet a murderer. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the soles of his feet, a sound of profound and weary resignation, he made his choice. He gently worked his arms beneath her, surprised at how little she weighed. She was all sharp angles and bones, a fragile, frozen bird. He lifted her into his arms. She murmured something, a faint, incoherent whisper against his chest. Holding her, he looked around the decaying cabin, at the toppled cradle, at the cold, empty hearth. He was bringing life back into a tomb. He did not know if it was an act of kindness or an act of sheer, unforgivable madness. Turning his back on the ghosts, Silas Boone carried the unconscious woman out into the swirling snow, walking toward the shelter he had built to escape his past, now dragging a piece of it back with him. The first thing to return was the warmth. It was a feeble thing, a mere suggestion of heat on her face. But after the soul-deep cold she had known, it felt like a resurrection. Then came the smell of wood smoke, sharp and clean in her nostrils. Then the sound, the soft, rhythmic crackle of a fire. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, heavy as stones. The world was a blur of shadow and flickering orange light. She was lying on a pallet of pine boughs, the scent of the forest rising from beneath her, a coarse wool blanket, smelling of smoke and animal hide, was pulled up to her chin. A low fire struggled for life in a great stone hearth opposite her, its flames casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn log walls. This was the cabin she had found, the ruin in the woods. But it was different. It was warmer. It was alive. A shape moved in the shadows near the door, and fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back with a soft gasp. Her body was a foreign country, a landscape of aches and profound weakness. The shape resolved itself into a man. He was immense, a figure carved from the mountain itself, his shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. A thick, dark beard covered most of his face, and his hair was long and unkempt. He stepped partially into the firelight, and she saw eyes the color of a winter sky, wary and unreadable. He was the one who had found her, the mountain man. He said nothing, simply watched her. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was a terrible, lonely sound, a reminder of the storm she had nearly died in. "Where?" Her voice was a dry rasp, a stranger's voice. She coughed, a weak, rattling sound. The man moved to the fire, picking up a tin cup from the hearth. He ladled a thin, steaming broth into it from a pot hanging over the flames, his movements economical and precise. He crossed the small room in 2 long strides and knelt beside her, not close, but near enough to hand her the cup. His presence was overwhelming, a mix of raw strength and a deep, unnerving stillness. "Drink," he said. The word was a rumble, a sound dredged up from a place of long disuse. It was coarse and gravelly, as if his throat had forgotten the shape of speech. Eleanor took the cup with trembling hands. The hot tin burned her fingers, a welcome, grounding pain. She brought it to her lips and sipped. It was a simple broth, made from wild game, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was life. It slid down her throat, a warm current spreading through her frozen limbs. When the cup was empty, he took it from her and filled a second one with water from a bucket near the door. She drank that, too, the cool water soothing her raw throat. He took the empty cup and set it back on the hearth. Then, without another word, he pulled on a heavy coat made of some shaggy, dark fur, picked up an axe that was leaning against the wall, and went outside, closing the crooked door behind him. The latch, a simple wooden bar, settled into place with a dull thud. Eleanor was left alone in the fire-lit quiet. The fear receded, replaced by a vast and weary confusion. The man had saved her. He had brought her here, built a fire, and given her sustenance. Yet he had looked at her not with kindness, but with a guarded, almost pained, tolerance, as if her very presence were a burden he had reluctantly shouldered. Slowly, her eyes began to take in the details of her shelter. It was the same cabin. She was sure of it. She could see the section of the roof where the shakes had rotted through. As her eyes adjusted, she saw that tiny flecks of snow still drifted down through the larger gaps, melting before they hit the floor. The floor itself was made of wide, rough planked boards, many of them warped and uneven. They creaked with every gust of wind that pressed against the old log walls. The chinking between the logs was cracked and crumbling, and in some places, she could see the pale light of the snow-filled day through the gaps. This place was not just old, it was wounded. It was a home that had suffered a great loss and been left to die. Her gaze fell upon the corner where she had seen the toppled cradle. It was still there, and beside it, half hidden in the shadows, lay a small, crudely carved wooden horse. Its paint was faded. One of its legs was broken, but it lay on the dusty floor as if waiting for a child's hand to pick it up. A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. This was not an abandoned trapper's hut. This had been a home. A family had lived here. A sharp, rhythmic thwack began from outside. Echoing through the thin walls, the man was chopping firewood. The sound was steady, relentless, each blow of the axe a declaration of his existence against the howling storm. He was a man of action, not words. A man who kept the encroaching death of the wilderness at bay with the strength of his arms. Hours passed. Eleanor drifted in and out of a weak, fitful sleep. Each time she woke, the fire was a little stronger. A small pile of freshly split logs stacked neatly beside it. The man remained outside. She wondered if he meant to stay out there all day, in the heart of the blizzard. Perhaps he preferred the company of the storm to hers. Late in the afternoon, he returned. He was covered in snow, his beard and eyebrows white with it. He shook the worst of it off on the doorstep before entering, his movements like those of a great bear shaking off water. He did not look at her, but went straight to the fire, adding several logs until it was blazing, chasing the darkest shadows from the corners of the room. He hung his frozen coat on a peg by the door and began to prepare a meal. He moved with a quiet competence, slicing meat from a joint of venison with a long, sharp knife and adding it to the pot with a handful of dried roots. The silence grew heavy again, thick with unspoken questions. Eleanor knew she had to break it. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little stronger now. He paused in his stirring, his back to her. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "You saved my life," she insisted gently. "I would have died out there." He turned his head slightly, his profile stark in the firelight. "Storm would have taken you," he said, his voice still rough. It was a statement of fact, not an acknowledgement of his own part in her survival. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated for a long moment, as if trying to recall it himself. "Silas," he finally said. "Silas Boone. I am Eleanor Vance." He gave another one of his short nods and turned back to the pot. The conversation, it seemed, was over. But Eleanor could not let it be. She looked toward the forgotten toy in the corner. "This was your home?" His shoulders stiffened. He stopped stirring the stew. "It was the cradle, the horse," she began, her voice soft with a question she was almost afraid to ask. "They were my daughters," he said, his voice flat and hard, a stone wall dropping between them. He began to stir the pot again, faster this time. The scrape of the spoon against the iron a harsh, grating sound. Eleanor fell silent. She had trespassed on sacred ground. The air in the cabin was suddenly thick with ghosts, with the memory of a child's laughter and a life that had been violently extinguished. They ate in silence, the rich, hot stew a balm to Eleanor's starved body. Silas ate quickly, hunched over his bowl on the three-legged stool, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he was finished, he took her empty bowl, rinsed both in the bucket of water, and then settled on the floor on the far side of the hearth, his back against the log wall. He began to mend a tear in a leather pouch, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft with the needle and sinew. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. He would tolerate her presence, provide for her basic needs. In return, she would not press into the raw, wounded places of his past. Her survival had placed her in his debt, and she repaid it with the currency of silence. She was grateful. He was wary. It was a strange and delicate balance. For 3 more days, the snow fell without pause. The world outside the cabin was a swirling vortex of white. The snow piled up against the walls, covering the lower half of the window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. Travel was impossible. They were prisoners together in this decaying box of memories. Eleanor's strength slowly began to return. The deep, aching weakness in her limbs lessened, and the fog in her mind cleared. With her returning health came a restless energy, a need to do something, to be something other than a helpless invalid. "I will leave as soon as the storm breaks," she announced one morning, her voice firm. "I will not be a burden to you any longer." Silas looked up from the snare he was fixing, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "Nowhere to go," he stated, his eyes flicking toward the snow-choked window. "Mountains will kill you sure as a bullet." "I must," she insisted, though a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. He was right. She had no food, no proper clothing, no idea where she was. But the thought of remaining here indefinitely, a silent specter in this man's lonely life, was unbearable. He did not argue. He simply went back to his work, leaving her with the cold, hard truth of her situation. That afternoon, she could not stand the idleness any longer. While Silas was outside, presumably clearing a path or checking his traps, she found a broom made of bound twigs in the corner and began to sweep the floor. Dust, dirt, and the debris of years of neglect rose in a cloud. She swept it all into the fire. She found a rag and, using water from the bucket, wiped down the dusty table and stool. The small acts of cleaning were a comfort, a way of imposing a small amount of order on the chaos of her life. She was making a space for herself, however temporary. When Silas returned, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room. He did not say anything, but she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps. He tracked no snow inside, carefully knocking his boots against the doorframe before stepping onto the newly cleaned floor. A small, unspoken shift had occurred. She was no longer just a piece of helpless baggage he had dragged in from the storm. The next day, he began to work on the cabin itself. He climbed onto the roof, his movements sure-footed despite the snow, and began clearing it away to relieve the strain on the sagging timbers. He then used pieces of bark and scavenged planks to patch the worst of the holes. Eleanor, watching from below, felt a pang of admiration for his quiet competence, his stubborn refusal to let the wilderness win. When he came back inside, shivering with cold, she had a cup of hot broth waiting for him. He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. His skin was rough as bark and cold as ice. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. He drank the broth, his eyes never leaving her face. "The chinking," he said, his voice less gravelly than before. "Between the logs. It needs to be redone. The wind gets through." "How?" she asked. He showed her how to mix clay from the creek bank, which he brought inside in a bucket to thaw, with dry grass and moss. It was messy, cold work, but they worked together, pressing the thick paste into the gaps between the logs. Her small, nimble fingers could reach into crevices his larger hands could not. They did not speak much, but a rhythm developed between them, a shared purpose that was more intimate than any conversation. They were fighting the same enemy, the cold. They were, for the first time, a team. That evening, the storm finally began to subside. The wind still mourned around the eaves of the cabin, but its furious edge was gone. The fire burned brightly, the newly patched walls holding in the heat far better than before. A feeling of peaceful exhaustion settled over Eleanor. They had worked hard. The cabin, while still a ruin, felt more like a sanctuary now. It felt almost like a home, feeling a deep, quiet contentment. Eleanor sat on the hearth, staring into the flames. Without thinking, she began to hum. It was an old song, a simple, gentle lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was a child, a song of green valleys and quiet streams. She heard a sharp intake of breath from the doorway. She turned. Silas stood there, a brace of snared rabbits in his hand. He was frozen, his face a mask of shock and a pain so raw it stole her breath. The rabbit slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. He stared at her, but his eyes were seeing something else, something from a long time ago. He looked utterly broken. "What?" he started, his voice a choked whisper. "What is that song?" Eleanor's humming died in her throat. It is just an old lullaby. My mother—" "Sarah," he breathed, the name a wisp of smoke in the cold air. He stumbled forward and sank onto the stool, his head in his hands. She used to sing that song, for Lily, every night. The story he had refused to tell in words now came flooding into the small cabin. Eleanor could see it all. This rough, silent man, younger then, sitting by this same fire, watching his wife rock their child to sleep. The sweet, simple melody filling the warm, safe space he had built for them. The loss was no longer an abstract fact. It was a living, breathing presence in the room. A grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. The storm clouds in them had broken, and they were filled with a terrible, unshed grief. "She died right there," he whispered, his gaze moving to the pallet of boughs where Eleanor now slept. "The fever took her so fast. Then Lily, she followed a week later. There was nothing I could do. This place is full of them." Tears glistened on his lashes, catching the firelight like tiny diamonds. He spoke of his past for the first time, and the act of it seemed to tear him apart. The vulnerability was too much to bear. Before the tears could fall, he pushed himself to his feet with a violent, jerky motion. He looked at Eleanor, his face a mess of anguish and confusion, as if she were somehow to blame for resurrecting the ghosts. Without another word, he turned and fled, throwing open the door and stumbling out into the cold, moonlit snow, seeking a pain that could match the one that was raging inside him. Eleanor sat by the fire, alone once more, the echo of the lullaby hanging in the air like a prayer. She now understood. He hadn't just saved her from the storm. He had carried her into the heart of his own. After Silas fled into the snow, a new and fragile understanding settled in the cabin. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a void of unspoken questions, but a space filled with a shared, acknowledged grief. He returned near dawn, his face haggard and frozen, and said nothing of his flight. He simply added wood to the fire and began the day's work. Eleanor, in turn, asked nothing. She had seen the raw heart of his pain, and she knew it was a wilderness as vast and untamed as the mountains outside. Winter did not relent. It sank its teeth deeper into the land, burying the world under a blanket of white so thick and seamless that the valley lost all its familiar contours. Blizzards swept down from the high peaks, great howling furies of wind and snow that would last for days, imprisoning them in the small, dim cabin. During these storms, the world shrank to the 4 log walls, the flickering fire, and the two of them. They moved around each other in the cramped space with a practiced, quiet grace, their lives pared down to the essential rhythms of survival. Food became their primary concern. The buck Silas had killed was a godsend, but it would not last forever. Every portion of meat was carefully rationed, stewed with the last of the dried roots and wild onions to make it stretch. The haunches and back straps were hung high in the rafters, frozen solid, to be shaved off a little at a time. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones were boiled and reboiled until they gave up every last bit of their richness. Hunger became a quiet, constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened their senses and made every meager meal a sacrament. Together, they continued their fight against the cabin's decay, using the hide from the deer. Silas painstakingly patched the largest hole in the roof, stitching the thick skin to the wooden shakes with an awl and sinew. It was slow, freezing work, and Eleanor helped, holding the stiff, cold hide in place with numb fingers while he did the stitching. Their breaths plumed in the frigid air, their movements synchronized by the shared, desperate need for shelter. They were two solitary creatures, bound together by a common purpose, to endure. For Eleanor, a strange sense of peace began to bloom in the heart of the hardship. The strict, suffocating world of her father's house felt like a lifetime away. Here, there were no judgments, no expectations of propriety, only the stark, honest demands of the day. She found a deep and abiding solace in the simple routines that marked their existence. Her first task each morning was to fetch water. She would take the bucket and follow the path Silas had dug through the snow to the creek. The stream was frozen thick, and she had to use a heavy rock to smash a hole in the ice, the sharp cracks echoing in the crystalline silence. The water below was so cold it felt like fire on her skin. But as she carried the full, sloshing bucket back to the cabin, a sense of accomplishment warmed her. She was contributing. She was useful. She learned to tend the fire, to bank the coals at night so a few embers would remain by morning, saving them the difficult task of starting a new one with flint and steel. She learned to identify the few hardy herbs that grew sheltered beneath the pines, and she would hang them from the rafters to dry, their clean, sharp scent mingling with the wood smoke. Silas had a companion Eleanor had not met during her first delirious week in the cabin. He was an old hound dog named Buck, a creature as weathered and scarred as his master. One evening, the dog limped into the cabin, whining softly, his muzzle and chest bristling with the quills of a porcupine. Silas cursed under his breath, his face tight with concern. "Hold him steady," he commanded Eleanor, while Silas held the old dog's head, his voice a low, soothing rumble. Eleanor took the pliers he used for mending traps and, one by one, began to pull the barbed quills from the hound's flesh. The dog yelped and whimpered, but he seemed to understand they were trying to help, and he bore the pain with a stoic trust. Eleanor's touch was gentle, her voice soft as she murmured words of comfort. It took nearly an hour, and when they were finished, she cleaned the wounds with a rag dipped in hot water. The dog licked her hand, his tail giving a weak thump against the floorboards. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He had seen a tenderness in her, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with surviving blizzards or rationing food. It was a different kind of resilience, a compassion that had not been frozen out of her. As the days passed, Silas began to teach her the ways of the mountains. He was a man who spoke the language of the wilderness, and he passed its grammar on to her in quiet, practical lessons. He showed her how to build a snare for a snowshoe hare, how to choose the right sapling for the spring pole and tie the knot so it would hold fast. He took her out on a rare, clear morning and taught her how to read the stories written in the snow, the delicate, hopping tracks of a squirrel, the deep cloven prints of a deer, the sinister, padded trail of a wolf. "Everything out here is either hunting or being hunted," he told her, his voice low. "You got to know which one you are." One afternoon, he was showing her how to set a larger trap for a fox. The mechanism was delicate, and he guided her hand, showing her how to place the trigger just so. His calloused, snow-chapped fingers closed over hers. A jolt, sharp and sudden as a spark from the fire, shot up her arm. His hand was large and warm, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to stop. The only sound, the whisper of the wind in the pines. It was a simple, accidental touch, but in the vast, empty space of their lives, it felt momentous. He pulled his hand away first, a muscle twitching in his jaw, and turned his attention back to the trap, a gruffness in his voice that had not been there a moment before, but the unspoken warmth of that touch lingered in the frozen air between them. That night, as the fire burned low, Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at Silas, who was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, comforting sound. "Silas?" she said softly. He looked up, his hand stilling. "I never thanked you properly," she whispered. "Not just for pulling me from the snow, but for all of this, for teaching me, for letting me stay." He looked down at his knife, his brow furrowed. "Didn't do it for thanks," he mumbled, his voice a low growl. He went back to his sharpening, the scraping sound harsher now, but Eleanor had seen his eyes before he looked away. The hardness was gone. replaced by something softer, something vulnerable and deeply human. His words were a wall, but his eyes were a window, and she had seen, just for a second, the lonely man hiding behind it. The sun came out the day after the next big snow, a rare and brilliant gift. The light reflecting off the fresh powder was almost blinding, and the sky was a deep, aching blue. The new snow was heavy, weighing down the pine boughs and putting a dangerous strain on their newly patched roof. "It's got to be cleared," Silas announced, "or its weight will bring the whole thing down on our heads." He propped a crude ladder against the side of the cabin and climbed up, a wide wooden shovel in his hands. He began to push the heavy snow off in great white sheets. Eleanor, feeling a rare surge of energy from the bright sun, climbed up after him. "I can help," she insisted, grabbing a smaller shovel he had made for her. He grunted, a sound that might have been disapproval or acceptance, but he did not send her down. They worked together under the brilliant, cold sun, a silent team. The work was hard, but invigorating. The clean, cold air filled her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive, her body strong and capable. She pushed a final load of snow over the edge and leaned on her shovel, breathing heavily. A real, genuine laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. "I imagine my father would be horrified to see me now," she said, a smile lighting up her face. Silas paused, looking at her. The sun caught the red highlights in her hair and the faint dusting of freckles on her nose. Her smile transformed her, erasing the last traces of the half-starved, desperate girl he had found. In that moment, she was beautiful. The sound of her laughter, so out of place in his silent world, startled him. He took a half-step toward her, and in that same instant, her foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Her arms flew out, a small cry of alarm escaping her lips. Before she could fall, Silas lunged, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her hard against him. They both froze. The world went silent again. Her back was pressed against his solid chest, his arms a band of steel around her. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. Her head was tilted back, and her face was just inches from his. She could see the flecks of gray in his beard, the fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the deep, startling gray of his irises. The air crackled with a sudden, powerful tension. It was the closeness of a man and a woman, intimate and undeniable. They were no longer rescuer and rescued, teacher and student. They were two people, utterly alone in a vast wilderness, clinging to each other on a snow-covered roof. A forbidden and necessary warmth bloomed between them, a feeling as dangerous and as vital as the fire in the hearth below. He released her as if she had burned him, taking a clumsy step back. "Be careful," he rasped, his voice thick. He turned away and began to shovel with a renewed, almost violent, energy. Eleanor stood for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs, her body still tingling where he had held her. The brief, bright joy of the morning was gone, replaced by a trembling awareness that had changed everything. The tension followed them back down into the cabin. That evening, the silence was heavier than ever, charged with the memory of their closeness on the roof. Eleanor finally broke it, needing to fill the space with something other than the frantic beating of her own heart. She told him about her father, about Mr. Finch, about the cold, final click of the door as it closed on her old life. "He said I was dead to him," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she stared into the flames. "Sometimes I believe him. I feel worthless, like something broken that was thrown away." Silas was quiet for a long time, feeding small sticks into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and quiet. "When the fever took Sarah and Lily, I thought about dying. Thought about it every day for a year. It would have been easy. Just walk out into a storm and lie down. But I didn't." He looked at her, his gaze direct and steady. "Worthless things don't fight so hard. You were half dead when I found you, starved and frozen, but you were still fighting. Out of everyone I've ever known, you're the only one who still fights to live." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had not offered pity or empty comfort. He had given her something far more valuable: respect. He had seen the one thing she still owned, the one thing her father could not take from her will to survive, and he had named it. The feeling of worthlessness began to recede, replaced by a fragile, budding sense of pride. Late one night, a week later, she awoke to a strange sound. It was a low, murmuring voice. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the faint, red glow, she could see Silas sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, a tin cup in his hand and a stone jug beside him. He was drinking. He was drunk, she realized, and he was talking to himself, or to someone who was not there. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with drink and sorrow. "I'm sorry. Sarah, I tried. It's just so cold." Eleanor's first instinct was to pretend she was asleep, to leave him to his private grief. It felt like an intrusion to witness him in this state, stripped bare of his usual stoic defenses. But then she thought of him sitting with her through her fevers, of him teaching her how to survive, of him catching her on the roof. He had not turned away from her brokenness. How could she turn away from his? Quietly, she slipped out from under her blankets. The floor was cold on her bare feet. She walked over and sat down on the floor a few feet away from him, pulling her own blanket around her shoulders. She did not speak. She did not touch him. She simply sat with him in the darkness. He fell silent when she sat down, but he did not tell her to leave. He took another long pull from his cup. They sat there for hours as the embers faded to gray ash, the silence a shared blanket covering their respective pains. He was mourning his dead, and she was mourning her lost life. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, their two solitudes touched. When the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the chinking, he set the cup down. He had not spoken another word. Eleanor had not moved. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear of the drink's haze, and in them, she saw a flicker of gratitude, and something more, a recognition. In that silent vigil, something had been forged between them. It was not love. Not yet. It was something more elemental. It was a fragile sense of belonging, born of shared pain and the quiet acceptance of each other's ghosts. Neither of them dared to name it, but they both knew it was the only thing keeping them alive. Spring did not arrive in the Rockies with a gentle announcement. It came as a slow, violent awakening. The world began to crack and groan. The silence of winter shattered by the thunder of distant avalanches and the roar of the creek, which swelled from a frozen trickle into a churning, mud-brown torrent. The immense weight of the snow began to melt, dripping from the pine boughs and running in rivulets down the mountainsides, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and thawed stone. For weeks, the valley was a sea of mud and slush, a landscape caught between death and rebirth. Then, one morning, Eleanor stepped outside and saw it. A single, defiant purple crocus pushing its way through a patch of bare, wet earth. It was a small thing, but it was a promise. Soon, other colors followed. The shy white of spring beauty, the bold yellow of glacier lilies, and the deep blue of larkspur began to dot the forest floor. The aspen trees, which had stood like pale skeletons all winter, began to bud, their branches hazed with a faint, hopeful green. The air grew warmer, filled with the drone of the first bees and the cheerful, insistent chirping of birds returning to the high country. The long siege was over. As the land transformed, so did the cabin. The deer-hide patch on the roof held fast against the spring rains. The new chinking, now dry and hard, kept the damp winds at bay. The smoke that curled from the stone chimney was no longer a desperate signal of survival. but a constant, comforting plume that spoke of hearth and home. Together, they turned over a small patch of earth near the creek, in the spot that got the most sun. The work was back-breaking. They used sharpened sticks to break up the rocky soil and their bare hands to pull out the stubborn roots of brush and weeds. Silas had a small pouch of seeds he had saved for years, a relic from his past life he had never had the heart to plant. Now, he brought them out. They planted squash, beans, and corn, their fingers pressing the tiny, precious seeds into the dark, damp soil. It was an act of profound faith, a wager against the uncertainties of the future. While Silas hunted and tended to his trap lines, Eleanor made the cabin her own, her world, which had been stripped down to the bare essentials of survival, began to expand to include small, quiet beauties. She gathered bouquets of wildflowers and placed them in a tin cup on the table. She found a discarded flour sack in Silas's meager supplies and, using a bone needle and thread pulled from the hem of her ruined dress, she painstakingly sewed it into a simple curtain for the window. It was a small, crude thing, but it softened the harsh light and gave the room a gentle, domestic feel. One afternoon, she took the silver cross from around her neck. It had been a constant weight against her skin, a reminder of her mother, of a life that was gone. With a sense of quiet ceremony, she hung it from a small nail on the wall above the hearth. It was the heart of their home, the place of warmth and sustenance. It was where the cross belonged. It was no longer a relic of a life she had lost, but a blessing upon the one she had found. The coming of spring seemed to thaw something in Silas as well. The deep, wintry gloom that had clung to him for so long began to recede. The hard lines around his eyes and mouth softened. One morning, while watching Eleanor clumsily try to split a piece of kindling with a hatchet, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. Soon after, the chuckles turned into genuine smiles, rare and wonderful things that transformed his grim, bearded face. He began to speak more freely, his voice losing its gravelly disuse. He told her stories of the mountains, of the habits of the elk and the cunning of the wolverine. He pointed out the constellations in the clear night sky, giving them their proper names, names he had not spoken aloud in years. He even began to tease her, his humor dry and gentle. He would watch her carefully wash her hands in the creek before a meal and ask, "You trying to wash the mountain off you, Eleanor?" Or when she marveled at the taste of a wild strawberry, he would say with a straight face, "Best be careful. Too much sweetness might spoil a proper city lady." She would laugh, a sound that now came easily, a bright, clear note in the quiet valley. "And you, Silas Boone," she retorted one evening as he stitched a tear in his buckskin shirt with surprising delicacy, "are a man half wild and half saint." He looked up at her, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips, and he did not disagree. They fell into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. They were inseparable, a unit of two against the vast wilderness. They worked together, ate together, and sat by the fire together in the evenings. The silence between them now one of easy companionship rather than awkward tension. But an invisible line still existed, a boundary of memory and unspoken feelings that neither of them dared to cross. The memory of his arms around her on the roof was a constant, simmering presence, a warmth that both comforted and unsettled them. They were closer than kin, yet they remained achingly apart, each afraid to disturb the fragile peace they had built. Their isolation was their sanctuary, but it could not last. One evening in late spring, as the sun was setting and casting long, golden shadows across the valley, a train of 3 pack mules and 2 riders appeared at the far end of the clearing. They were trappers, heading up to the high country for the summer season. They stopped short, their surprise evident, when they saw the smoke rising from the chimney and then Eleanor, standing by the creek. She froze, her heart seizing with a sudden, unfamiliar fear. The sight of other people, of strangers from the outside world, felt like a violation. They stared at her. A woman in a patched-up but clean dress, her auburn hair tied back with a strip of leather, looking far too refined for such a wild place. They looked from her to the cabin, where Silas had just appeared in the doorway, his rifle held loosely in his hand. The lead trapper, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes, tipped his hat. "Evening, ma'am, mister." He did not get off his horse. His gaze swept over Eleanor, then back to Silas, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Didn't figure this valley was claimed." "It is," Silas said, his voice flat. The man's smirk widened. He looked at Eleanor again, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Seems you've got it claimed right proper." He said a few low words to his companion, who laughed, a coarse, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet air. Without another word, they spurred their mules on, disappearing into the trees. Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. She had seen the look in the man's eyes, the way he had stripped her down with his gaze and judged her in an instant. The peace of the valley was shattered. The outside world had found them. It took 2 weeks for the poison to travel, 2 weeks for the trapper's story to reach a small, pious settlement a day's ride down the mountain. The story grew with each telling. The reclusive mountain man, Silas Boone, the one who had gone half mad after his family died, was keeping a woman in that haunted cabin, a young woman, a pretty woman. She was not his wife. She was, therefore, a fallen woman, a Jezebel in the wilderness. The judgment of that world arrived on a Sunday, in the form of a tall, gaunt man in a dusty black coat. He rode a sway-backed mare and carried a Bible with a cover worn as soft as buckskin. He introduced himself as the Reverend Michael Gideon. His eyes were the color of faded slate, and they burned with a cold, righteous fire. He refused to step inside the cabin, insisting on delivering his sermon from the doorway, as if the very air within were tainted with sin. "I have come," he announced, his voice ringing with clerical authority, "because I have heard tell of an abomination in this valley. I have come to speak for the souls of those living in sin." His gaze fell upon Eleanor, who stood frozen by the hearth. "Woman," he boomed, "have you no shame to live here unwed in the den of this wild man? Have you forsaken God's law and the virtue of your womanhood?" Every word was a lash. The color drained from Eleanor's face. The shame she had carried since leaving her father's house, the feeling of being worthless and discarded, came rushing back, a suffocating tide. This was what the world saw when it looked at her. Not a survivor, but a sinner. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor and the preacher. "You have no business here," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The Reverend was not deterred. He pointed a long, bony finger at Silas. "And you, sir, you prey upon this lost sheep, harboring her for your own carnal purposes. You profane the memory of your dead wife and child by turning their home into a sty of iniquity. Repent before you are both cast into the lake of fire." It was too much. A choked sob escaped Eleanor's lips. Tears of humiliation streamed down her face. She wanted to disappear, to run, to flee this place that had become her sanctuary and was now the source of her shame. "Silas, please," she wept. "I will go. I will leave. I will not bring this upon you." A terrible, cold fury ignited in Silas's eyes. He had lived with ghosts and grief, with silence and solitude. He had built a wall around his heart to keep the world out, and now the world had come, with its small, cruel judgments, to tear down the one good thing that had taken root in his desolate life. He took a step toward the preacher, his hands clenched into fists. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it trembled with a rage so profound that the Reverend actually took a step back. "Get off my land," Silas snarled. "This is God's land," the preacher retorted, though his conviction wavered. "Then God can tell you to leave," Silas said. He pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor. "Her name is Eleanor. She is not lost. She is not a sheep. And she is more virtuous in her little finger than you are in your entire black-coated soul." He took another step, and the preacher scrambled backward. Silas's voice dropped to a raw, ragged whisper, a vow spoken to the mountains themselves. "This is her home. She stays." With that, he slammed the heavy wooden door in the preacher's face. The boom echoed in the stunned silence of the cabin. Eleanor was still weeping, her shoulders shaking. Silas stood with his back to the door, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with the force of his fury. The world outside could go to hell. He had made his stand. That night, the anger faded, leaving a thick, charged atmosphere in its wake. They ate their meal in silence, the unspoken emotions a palpable presence between them. Silas's defense of her had been a revelation. He had not just offered her shelter, he had claimed her as his own, shielding her with the full force of his being. Her heart ached with a feeling so powerful, so overwhelming. It felt like it might break her ribs. It was gratitude, and it was admiration, and it was love. After they had eaten, as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his face grim and shadowed, she could not bear the distance between them any longer. She went to him, her movements slow and deliberate. She knelt before him on the hearth. "Silas," she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, weary pain. She did not know what to say, how to thank him for something so immense. Words were not enough. So, she leaned forward, her heart hammering, and gently, hesitantly, pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, trembling kiss, a question and a plea and a thank you all at once, for a single, breathtaking moment. He was still, his lips firm against hers. Then, with a low groan that sounded like it was torn from the depths of his soul, he pulled away. He pushed himself back, scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of torment. "No," he choked out, his eyes wide with a look of horror. "I can't." He looked around the cabin, at the hearth where his wife had cooked, at the corner where his daughter had slept, at the silver cross gleaming on the wall. The ghosts were all there, staring at him, accusing him. He was betraying them. He was replacing them. "Silas, Eleanor began, her voice breaking, the kiss turning to ash in her mouth. The rejection was a physical blow. Humiliated by the preacher, and now rejected by the one person she thought she could trust. Her fragile world shattered completely. A raw, ragged sob tore from her throat. She scrambled to her feet and fled, throwing open the door and running out into the night. A spring storm had broken. A cold rain was falling, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the peaks. She ran blindly, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her tears mingling with the storm. In the cabin, Silas stood frozen for a moment, torn between the ghosts of his past and the living, breathing woman in his present. The sound of her sobbing cut through his guilt-ridden haze. With a cry of his own, a sound of pure anguish, he ran after her into the wind and the rain. "Eleanor!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by a sudden, violent clap of thunder. "Eleanor!" The morning after the storm broke clear and clean, the air washed of dust and pollen. The world outside the cabin glistened, every leaf and stone baptized by the rain. But inside, a heavy silence lingered, thicker and more suffocating than any fog. They moved around each other like ghosts, the raw, unresolved emotions of the previous night a chasm between them. Eleanor's heart was a leaden weight in her chest, his rejection of her kiss, followed by his desperate, shouted pursuit in the rain, had left her in a state of profound confusion. He had held her then, his arms tight around her as she shivered, his face buried in her wet hair, whispering her name like a prayer. He had led her back to the cabin, dried her with a rough blanket, and sat with her by the fire until she slept. But he had not spoken a single word of explanation. Now, in the light of day, he was a stranger again, his face a grim, unreadable mask. She felt foolish and ashamed, as if she had offered something precious only to have it cast aside. For his part, Silas was trapped in a silent war with himself. When she had kissed him, his first instinctual response had been a surge of warmth, a feeling so long forgotten he had no name for it. But then the ghosts had risen, his wife's face superimposed over Eleanor's, the guilt a cold hand squeezing his heart. He had hurt her. He had seen it in her eyes before she fled. He had wanted to call her back, to explain the tangled mess of his grief and his growing affection for her. But the words would not come. He was a man more fluent in the language of silence and survival than in the matters of a wounded heart. So they worked. They fell back on the familiar rhythms that had seen them through the winter, the shared tasks a fragile bridge over the chasm of things unsaid. They worked in the garden side by side, their hands in the same soil, pulling weeds and tending the tender green shoots. He taught her how to skin the rabbits he caught, his instructions brief and technical, his hands never brushing hers. She cooked their meals, and they ate with the scrape of spoons against tin bowls as their only conversation. The silence was a constant ache, a testament to how deeply their connection had been fractured. This brittle peace lasted for nearly a week. Then, one bright afternoon, the outside world came for them again. It started with the sound of shod horses, a sound so alien in their quiet valley that they both froze. Looking up from the deer hide Silas was scraping, Eleanor saw them first, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. 4 riders. They were not trappers. These men wore dark, heavy coats and sturdy town boots. They sat their horses with an air of authority, their faces grim and purposeful. 2 of them had rifles resting in scabbards on their saddles. A cold, familiar dread washed over Eleanor. She recognized one of the men. His name was Mr. Henderson, her father's business manager, a man with a neat gray beard and eyes as cold and calculating as the numbers in a ledger. "Eleanor," Silas said, his voice a low warning. He had already moved to stand in front of her, his scraping tool still in his hand, his body a solid shield. "Mr." Henderson rode forward, stopping his horse a dozen yards from the cabin. He ignored Silas completely, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice smooth and controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Your father has sent us for you. It is time for you to come home." Home. The word was a bitter irony. "I have no home," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly, but clear. Henderson's gaze flickered to Silas, a look of profound disdain on his face. He took in the rough cabin, the patch of garden, Eleanor's patched dress, and the tall, bearded man standing guard over her. "Your father is a forgiving man. Miss Vance, he has heard of your misfortune. He is willing to overlook your rebellion and welcome you back into his house. He has asked us to escort you back to civilization." "I am not in need of an escort," she said. Silas had not moved, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him. He had set down the scraper and was slowly, deliberately, wiping his hands on his buckskin trousers. "With all due respect, ma'am, that is not for you to decide," Henderson said, his voice hardening. "You have been through a terrible ordeal. You are clearly not in your right mind. You are to come with us. Now." He gestured to one of his men, who began to dismount, a coil of rope on his saddle. That was when Silas moved. He did not run or shout. He simply took 3 long strides to the cabin door, stepped inside, and emerged a moment later with his Hawken rifle. He did not raise it or point it. He just held it, cradled in the crook of his arm, and stood on the small, rough porch. The rifle looked like a natural extension of him, as much a part of him as his own bones. His message was clear and absolute. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried across the clearing with the chilling finality of a closing coffin lid. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Step aside, mountain man," This is a family matter. It does not concern you. Everything that happens on this land concerns me, Silas replied, his gaze as steady and unyielding as the mountains behind him. And this is her home. This? Henderson made a show of looking around. His lip curled in a sneer. You call this hovel a home? She is a Vance. She was born to a life of comfort and society, not to live in squalor with a hermit. He turned his attention back to Eleanor, his voice softening into a tone of false reason. Eleanor, think of what you are doing. Think of what you are giving up. A warm bed, fine clothes, respectability. Your father is waiting. All is forgiven. Can this man, this savage, give you any of that? Eleanor looked from Henderson's smug, judgmental face to Silas, who stood on the porch like a granite statue, his entire being a silent declaration of loyalty. She saw the truth of her choice laid bare before her. It was a choice between a comfortable cage and a hard-won freedom. It was a choice between a life of polite, soul-crushing lies and a life of difficult, honest truth. It was a choice between the man who had given her life and then cast her out, and the man who had found her at the edge of death and patiently, painstakingly, helped her build a new one. She remembered the feel of her father's cold eyes, the finality of the closing door. Then she remembered the warmth of Silas's hand teaching her to set a snare, the pride in his eyes when he called her a fighter, the fierce, protective rage with which he had defended her from the preacher. Her fear and confusion vanished, replaced by a strength she did not know she possessed. She walked forward, away from the shelter of the cabin, and stopped beside Silas on the porch. She put her hand on his arm, a small, simple gesture of alliance, of belonging. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity that did not waver. You will tell my father that I am grateful for his offer, but you will also tell him that I have never known a day of true comfort until I came to this valley. You will tell him that respectability is a poor substitute for kindness, and you will tell him. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. That I would rather live poor in truth than rich in lies. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Henderson stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. He had come expecting a frightened, broken girl, eager to be rescued. He had found a woman, resolute and unbending. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. You have made your choice. Then, Miss Vance, your father anticipated this foolishness. He gave me one final message for you. Should you refuse his generosity? Henderson reached into his coat and pulled out a small, familiar object. It was a lady's silver locket, her mother's, the one she had left behind on her dresser. He instructed me to tell you that, from this day forward, he has no daughter. To him, and to the world, you are dead. He tossed the locket onto the ground. It landed in the dirt between them. A final, glittering insult. Let's go, Henderson snapped at his men. There is nothing for us here. They wheeled their horses around and rode away, not looking back, leaving the silver locket glinting in the sun. For a long moment after they were gone, Eleanor did not move. She stared at the spot where they had disappeared into the trees, the echo of her father's final rejection ringing in her ears. Dead to him. The words were a final, brutal severing. The last thread connecting her to her old life had been cut. Then, a great, shuddering sob broke from her. The strength that had held her up during the confrontation crumbled, and the full weight of her choice, of her loss, came crashing down. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if not for Silas. This time, he did not hesitate. He set the rifle aside and gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as the storm of her grief broke. She wept against his chest, her tears soaking his buckskin shirt, crying for the family she had lost, for the cruelty of the world, and for the sheer, terrifying finality of it all. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring her name, his touch no longer hesitant or guilty, but firm, steady, and infinitely comforting. He was shaken by the confrontation, his heart still pounding with adrenaline and pride, but all that mattered now was her. He held her and let her cry until the storm passed, leaving a quiet, weary peace in its wake. In the weeks that followed, it was as if the valley itself breathed a sigh of relief. With the threat of the outside world vanquished, a new and joyful energy took root. They worked on the cabin with a shared, unspoken purpose. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a life, a fortress of their own making. Silas, using skills he had not employed in years, finished the roof, replacing the temporary deer hide patch with perfectly fitted cedar shakes that he split himself. The roof was a masterpiece of function and simple beauty. He built a sturdy new door that closed with a satisfying thud, and he even fitted a pane of glass into the window, a treasure he had been saving from a trade long ago. The light that streamed in was clear and bright, filling the small space with warmth. The garden flourished under their constant care. The corn grew tall and green, and the squash vines, with their great, sunny blossoms, crept across the rich earth. They built a low stone wall around it to keep out the deer, their hands working together, their laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. The ghosts of the cabin had been laid to rest, replaced by the vibrant, living spirit of the home they were creating. The invisible line between them had vanished, erased by her choice and his acceptance. The awkward silence was replaced by an easy intimacy. They touched often now, a hand on an arm to steady her on a steep path, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her a cup. Each touch was a quiet affirmation of the bond they had forged. Their love, which had been a fragile, struggling seedling, finally blossomed one quiet evening. The day's work was done. They sat on the porch, watching the last rays of the sun paint the high peaks in shades of rose and gold. Buck, the old hound, lay at their feet, sighing contentedly. Eleanor leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. It felt natural. Right. My family abandoned me, she said softly, her voice full of wonder rather than sadness. They threw me away, but you built me a home. Silas was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley, at the smoke rising from their chimney, at the garden that promised a harvest. He put his arm around her, pulling her closer. No, he said, his voice deep and sure. You built it with me. He turned to her then, and in his eyes, she saw no more ghosts, no more guilt, only a love as vast and as steady as the mountains that surrounded them. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this time, there was no hesitation, no pulling away. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of a future built together, a love that had been tested by winter and found worthy of the spring. The summer that followed was a season of quiet miracles. The valley, healed from the violence of the spring thaw, came alive with a deep, humming vitality. The corn in their garden grew taller than a man's head, its tassels catching the sunlight like threads of gold. The squash vines sprawled in a tangled, glorious mess, their broad leaves sheltering plump, heavy gourds. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of pine and the drone of happy bees. Birds Eleanor had never seen before flitted through the aspen groves, their songs a constant, cheerful melody from dawn till dusk. Their life settled into a rhythm as natural and steady as the turning of the seasons. They worked hard, their days filled with the satisfying labor of building a life from the ground up. They harvested their crops and preserved them for the coming winter, a bounty that filled their small cabin with the promise of security. The wood they chopped was stacked high against the cabin wall, a bulwark against the cold they knew would eventually return. The world outside the valley had not forgotten them, but its judgment had softened into a quiet, grudging respect. The story of the preacher's dismissal and Silas's fierce defense of Eleanor had spread. Alongside the tale of her bold rejection of her father's men, people were beginning to see them not as sinners, but as survivors who wished only to be left alone. One day, a wagon belonging to a settler family, the Millers, broke an axle not far from their clearing. Silas, without a word, took his tools and spent the better part of the afternoon helping the flustered man, Thomas Miller, repair the damage. While they worked, Eleanor brought out cool water from the creek and a small basket of wild berries for his wife and their young son, Jacob, Mrs. Miller was shy at first, her eyes full of the wary curiosity of the rumors she had heard. But Eleanor's gentle manner and open smile slowly disarmed her. By the time the wagon was fixed, the woman's suspicion had been replaced by a quiet gratitude. They did not become friends, not in the way of town folk, but a thread of understanding had been woven. They were no longer outcasts, but neighbors. Life was good. It was simple and hard, but it was real, and it was theirs. The love between Eleanor and Silas was the silent, steady heart of it all. It was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he had found on his trap line, the way she would save him the best piece of roasted venison, the way their hands would find each other as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. It was a love that needed few words, for it was spoken in every shared task, every quiet glance, every beat of their peaceful, intertwined lives. The tragedy, when it came, was as swift and merciless as the bandits who had first cast her into this wilderness. It was late August, a day that had begun with a clear sky but had turned sultry and oppressive by noon. Dark, bruised-looking clouds began to pile up over the high peaks to the west, and a low, distant rumble of thunder echoed down the valley. That afternoon, the Miller family passed by. On their way back from a trip to the settlement, they stopped to thank Silas and Eleanor again for their help, and young Jacob, a boy of 8 with a thatch of blonde hair and an adventurous spirit, ran down to the creek to skip stones while the adults talked. The storm broke with a sudden, shocking violence. The sky opened up, and a torrential rain began to fall, turning the air gray and misty. It was no gentle summer shower. This was a mountain deluge, a furious assault of water that quickly turned the creek from a placid stream into a raging, muddy beast. A sound like a freight train began to echo from up the canyon. Silas's head shot up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Flash flood!" he yelled over the roar of the storm. "Get back! Get away from the creek!" Thomas Miller grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her toward the high ground of the cabin. But in the confusion, everyone's eyes went to the creek, searching for the boy. Jacob was trapped. He had been playing on a large, flat rock in the middle of the stream, and the rising water had cut him off from the bank. Now, a churning wall of brown water, filled with branches and debris, was thundering down the canyon toward him. The boy was frozen with terror, his small face a white mask of panic. Eleanor screamed his name, "Mrs." Miller let out a grief-stricken cry. There was no time. The flood was moments away. Silas did not hesitate. He moved with the explosive speed of a cornered animal. Sprinting toward the creek bank, he plunged into the churning, waist-deep water, fighting the powerful current that sought to tear him from his feet. He was halfway to the boy when the main wall of the flood hit. The world became a nightmare of roaring water and chaos. Eleanor watched in horror as Silas was knocked off his feet, disappearing for a terrifying moment under the brown surge. He came up, sputtering, his face grim with determination. He lunged for the rock just as the water swept over it, grabbing Jacob's small arm. He got a firm hold on the boy, pulling him close, turning his own body to shield the child from the worst of the flood's fury. A massive log, a whole tree trunk torn from the mountainside, came rolling and tumbling in the torrent. It was moving with incredible speed. Eleanor screamed a warning, but he could not hear her over the roar. The log slammed into Silas, striking him hard in the back and side. A terrible, guttural cry of pain was ripped from his throat. His grip on the boy faltered, but he did not let go. With a final, desperate heave, he threw Jacob toward the bank, where his father, who had waded into the shallows, was able to grab him and pull him to safety. But the current had Silas. It tumbled him over and over, dragging him downstream. His head struck a submerged rock, and his body went limp. He was being swept away. "Silas!" Eleanor's shriek was a raw, animal sound. Forgetting her own safety, she ran along the bank, her eyes locked on his inert form. The floodwaters were already beginning to recede as quickly as they had come, their initial fury spent. Silas's body snagged on a tangle of roots near the far bank, 100 yards downstream. With Thomas Miller's help, they managed to get a rope around him and drag him from the water. He was unconscious, his face deathly pale beneath his beard. A great, dark bruise was already purpling across his ribs, and a nasty gash on his temple was bleeding freely into his wet hair. They carried him back to the cabin, a dead weight between them. The Millers were frantic with a mixture of terror and overwhelming gratitude. They helped her get Silas onto the bed, their faces pale with shock. "We'll ride for the doctor," Thomas Miller said, his voice shaking. "It's a day's ride, but—" Eleanor shook her head, her focus narrowing to the man lying broken on their bed. "There is no time," she said, her own voice a strange, calm whisper in the heart of her terror. "Please, just help me get his wet clothes off, and bring me all the clean cloth you have." She had learned much in the mountains. She had learned how to be strong. Now, she would learn if she had learned enough. After the Millers had done all they could and finally, reluctantly, departed, leaving her with a promise to pray, Eleanor began her vigil. The woman who had once been terrified of a splinter now became a healer. She cleaned the gash on his head with whiskey and stitched it closed with a fine needle and sinew, her hand steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She examined his torso, her gentle probing revealing at least 2 broken ribs. She bound his chest tightly with strips of clean linen. A fever set in that night, a raging fire that left him shivering and delirious. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat by his side, bathing his face and chest with cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips. He tossed and turned, muttering names she did not recognize, and sometimes the names of his wife and child, but most often he murmured her name, Eleanor, safe. She bent over him, her tears falling hot on his chest, mingling with the cool water from her cloth. "I am here, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed sobs. "I am safe. You must come back to me. Do not leave me alone in this place. Please, do not leave me." She prayed, not to the distant, judgmental God of the preacher, but to the spirit of the mountains themselves, the wild, impartial divinity that had taken so much and given so much. She prayed for the life of the man who had become her entire world. For 2 days and 2 nights, he hovered in the gray space between life and death. Eleanor's world shrank to the small, fire-lit cabin, to the rhythm of his ragged breaths, to the fight for his life. She was exhausted, her body aching with fatigue, but she did not falter. She was the fighter now. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. She awoke from a brief, fitful doze in her chair to find him looking at her, his eyes clear and calm. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice weak. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her. Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy this time. "Silas," she breathed, taking his hand. "You came back." His recovery was slow, but it was steady. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath, and then exhale in relief. Thomas Miller returned, not with a doctor, but with a basket of food from his wife, and the news that young Jacob was safe and sound, and spoke of Silas as a hero. The quiet respect of their neighbors had blossomed into genuine admiration and friendship. The near-death experience settled a profound quiet upon both of them. They had built a life, a home, a love they had thought was as solid as the mountains. The flood had shown them it was as fragile as a wildflower, a precious, beautiful thing that could be swept away in an instant. Life was a gift, They now knew. A temporary reprieve from the darkness, and it was not to be wasted. One afternoon, a month later, when Silas was strong enough to walk with the aid of a staff, he led her to a tall, ancient pine tree that stood on a small rise overlooking the cabin. Its branches were wide and sheltering, and the ground beneath was a soft carpet of fragrant needles. "We should be married, Eleanor," he said, his voice simple and direct. It was not a question. It was a statement of a truth that had become as essential as breathing. She looked at him, her heart full. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we should." Their wedding was 2 days later. Beneath the sheltering branches of the great pine, Eleanor wore her best dress, the one she had painstakingly mended, and she had woven a crown of late summer wildflowers for her hair. Silas wore a clean linen shirt she had made for him. Their only witnesses were young Jacob Miller, his eyes wide with solemn importance, and old Buck, who lay faithfully at their feet. They spoke no fancy words, had no preacher to bless them. They simply joined hands and faced each other. "I, Silas Boone, take you, Eleanor Vance, to be my wife," he said, his voice deep and steady. "To be my partner in this life. I will protect you and honor you, for as long as the mountains stand." "And I, Eleanor Vance," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "Take you, Silas Boone, to be my husband, to be my home and my heart. I will stand by you and care for you all the days of my life." He slipped a ring he had carved from a piece of deer antler onto her finger. It was a simple, beautiful thing, a circle of white against her skin, and there, witnessed by the quiet mountains, the grateful child, and the loyal hound, they became husband and wife. The cabin, which she had first seen as a rotting symbol of loss and decay, now stood below them as a beacon. Its new roof was sound, its window glowed, and the stone wall around their flourishing garden was a testament to their shared strength. It was no longer a tomb for his past, but the cradle of their future. That evening, sitting on the porch as man and wife, he took her hand. "You know," he said, his voice soft with wonder, "when I first found you, lying frozen in that cabin, I thought I was saving you." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a love that humbled her. "Turns out, you saved me first." Later that night, by the light of a tallow candle, Eleanor opened a small, leather-bound journal she had fashioned for herself. She dipped a quill pen into a pot of ink made from boiled walnuts, and in her neat, careful hand, she wrote the first and only entry. "My family abandoned me, but the mountains gave me back everything they took." She closed the book and looked at her husband, who was sleeping peacefully in their shared bed, his chest rising and falling in a steady, life-affirming rhythm. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into a soft, comfortable darkness. Outside, dusk settled over the valley. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from their chimney, a silent prayer of thanks to the sky. The cabin glowed, a single, warm point of light against the vast, eternal, and benevolent wilderness. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow listeners. Be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.